You've already planned it, don't lie. At some point, maybe during a boring commute, maybe at 2 a.m. when you couldn't sleep, you ran the scenario. Where you'd go, what you'd grab, who you'd save. You cast yourself in the leading role without even realizing it. The lone survivor, resourceful, calm under pressure, somehow always finding a functioning vehicle with a full tank of gas. You've watched enough movies to feel like you have a working knowledge of the apocalypse. You've mentally rehearsed the opening act so many times it almost feels like experience. And that quiet confidence, that's the thing that gets you killed first. Because here's what nobody in the survival space will actually say out loud. The zombie apocalypse doesn't start with a dramatic news broadcast and a montage of panicking crowds. It starts with a Tuesday, a weird Tuesday, where your neighbor seems off, where a coworker calls in sick for the third day running, where the internet feels slightly slow and the news feels slightly wrong, the way news always feels just before something massive cracks open underneath it. No soundtrack, no establishing shot. It doesn't announce itself. It seeps in through the ordinary, through the mundane texture of a day that feels almost normal, but keeps producing small details that don't quite add up. And by the time you've recognized what's happening, by the time the pattern becomes undeniable, the window for smart decisions is already halfway closed. So let's do something the movies have never once had the nerve to do. Let's run the actual simulation. No hero arc, no slow-motion weapon grabs, no conveniently empty highways at golden hour. Just biology, crowd behavior, sleep physics, infection modeling, and brutal probability. Because if this ever happened, the rules would look nothing like what you've spent years rehearsing in your head. Start with noise. Every zombie film treats noise as a simple dramatic mechanic. You knock something over, the horde turns, chase sequence, close escape, breathless safety. You breathe, audibly, rhythmically, without pause. Your shoes compress gravel and creak on floorboards and drag slightly on pavement. Your stomach growls at the worst possible moment because your body doesn't care about tactical timing. Your jacket shifts when you move. You scratch an itch without thinking. You swallow, you blink, and even that has a sound if everything else is quiet enough. Every single second of your conscious life produces acoustic output that you have never once in your entire life had any reason to manage or reduce. You've been moving through the world assuming background noise covers you. In a collapsed, emptied urban environment, no traffic, no HVAC systems, no crowd hum, the acoustic landscape changes completely. What was invisible becomes loud. Now ask yourself honestly, how quiet do you actually think you are right now, sitting wherever you are? Really think about it. Count the sounds your body is making without your permission. A group of infected individuals stripped to brainstem level function wouldn't be waiting for a dramatic crash. They would be calibrated over time to the low persistent hum of biological life, the exhale pattern, the irregular footfall, the fabric shift that happens every time a living body adjusts its weight. Reducing that signature is not something you improvise under stress. Special Forces operators train for years to move quietly through hostile environments, and every honest account from that world acknowledges that total silence is physiologically impossible while alive. You don't have that training, which means every minute you spend in proximity to a large infected population isn't a standoff you can manage with caution. It's a countdown running on a timer you cannot see and cannot stop. But noise, as terrifying as that is at least a problem you can partially address. You can slow down, you can practice, you can choose routes that favor soft ground over hard surfaces. What you cannot address as easily is what the infection itself does to your ability to trust anything around you, including your own perception of what's safe. And this is where the simulation stops being uncomfortable and starts being genuinely stomach-dropping frightening. Films give you a clean timeline. Someone gets bitten, there's a window, 12 hours, maybe 48. Symptoms appear in a legible sequence. There's a tearful conversation with enough time to say everything that matters. A decision gets made. The audience always knows exactly where they are in the arc because the arc is designed to be readable. But when epidemiologists model fast-spreading neurological pathogens, and they do model these seriously for biodefense and pandemic preparedness purposes, the most dangerous scenarios are never the ones with predictably short incubation periods. They're the ones with variable incubation. Some hosts converting within hours of exposure, others carrying it fully, moving through space, interacting with people, breathing recycled air in small rooms for 2, 3, sometimes 4 days, showing almost nothing on the outside. Still mobile, still coherent enough to pass casual observation, completely undetectable without laboratory equipment you no longer have access to. That's not a narrative device designed to create tension. That's what evolutionary pressure actually produces in a successful pathogen. A virus that converts every host immediately birds through its population too fast. It runs out of new targets before it can spread far. A pathogen with a percentage of long window carriers who remain social and ambulatory and indistinguishable from the uninfected, that's the architecture of something that crosses cities, then borders, before anyone has assembled enough data to understand what they're dealing with. Now stop thinking about abstract cities. Picture yours, the specific roads you take to work, the neighborhoods you know well enough to navigate without thinking, the density of the area within a 5-kilometer radius of where you sleep. Epidemiological modeling of fast-spread neurological collapse, drawing on real pathogen behavior data, real urban density metrics, consistently produces saturation timelines for major metropolitan environments of as little as 11 days in some models. 11 days from first confirmed case to majority conversion in a city of 1 million people. That number assumes no air travel, no rail, no highway movement between cities, a containment scenario that has never once been fully achieved in the entire recorded history of infectious disease outbreak response. Not once. So the real clock is shorter than 11 days, and it started running before the first confirmed case was confirmed, when it was still just a cluster of unusual symptoms that someone filed under possible novel respiratory illness monitoring. You still think you have time to carefully pack the perfect bug-out bag? This is where the person watching this says, okay, but I'll leave early. I'll recognize it faster than most people. I'll be 3 steps ahead of the panic wave. Maybe that early departure instinct is actually correct, and the first 12 hours of recognition genuinely do matter, and we'll come back to that. But here's what you'll be carrying with you when you leave, and it's the problem that no amount of early departure solves. You cannot verify your own status. Variable incubation means the most dangerous person in your survivor group might already be incited, might have been incited since before you left, might be you. You will feel fine, you will be certain you're unaffected, and you will be unable to prove it to anyone, including yourself. That uncertainty, not the horde outside, but the uncertainty living inside your group, inside your own body, is what begins destroying survivor groups on day 2, before the food runs low, before the external threat escalates. The fracture starts from the inside, from an unanswerable question nobody wants to ask out loud. Because this is where the simulation and the movie version diverge most violently and most permanently.
Every film assembles a core group, 5 to 8 people. Conveniently diverse skill sets, some interpersonal friction for dramatic texture, eventually unity forged under fire. Beautiful narrative structure. Cooperation surges within pre-existing tight social networks, among people who already know each other, already have established trust, already have a shared history. And it collapses, measurably, predictably, fast, among strangers thrown together by circumstance. Not because people are selfish in some abstract moral sense, because the primate brain under resource stress defaults to proximity-based trust hierarchies, and strangers haven't earned placement in that hierarchy. There's no shortcut. Shared danger feels like bonding, but it doesn't produce the underlying neurological trust architecture that shared history does. Shared panic is not shared loyalty, it's kindling. And the fracture doesn't arrive over anything cinematic. It arrives over who ate slightly more than their share at a meal nobody tracked carefully enough, over a decision made unilaterally when group consensus was expected, over whose child's noise is creating risk that everyone is thinking about and nobody is saying, over 2 people who haven't slept properly in 3 days arriving at a disagreement with no established hierarchy to resolve it and no emotional reserves left to manage it gracefully. Imagine it's day 4. Your best friend, someone you've known for years, someone whose presence was the main reason you felt okay about any of this, starts rubbing their eyes constantly. Their voice sounds slightly rougher than yesterday. They're sweating a little more than the temperature warrants. Is that early conversion? Is that dehydration from 2 days of inadequate water intake? Is that the same acute stress response that's affecting every single person in your group? Do you say it out loud? Do you watch them while they sleep that night and feel viscerally sick about the fact that you're watching them? Do you tell the others and then have to look at your best friend's face when they register what you just implied about them? Do you stay quiet and carry the weight of the question alone and feel what that does to every interaction you have with them from that point forward? That moment, not a breach in the perimeter, not a supply shortage, not any of the cinematic threats you rehearsed, that moment is where most groups break. Because there's no protocol for it, no pre-established procedure, no training, just two people who used to trust each other completely, now standing on opposite sides of a question that cannot be answered with available resources, trying to make a decision that could be catastrophically wrong in either direction. Military units solved this exact problem with manufactured cohesion, months of shared training, shared language, shared hierarchy, deliberate repetition of small decisions together before large ones are required. Your ad hoc survivor group has exactly none of that infrastructure. What it has is shared adrenaline, which feels like cohesion and functions like an accelerant. So you need people, the right people, assembled around the right capabilities, held together by something older and more durable than emergency bonding. And because after the initial chaos subsides, after the first 2 to 4 weeks of acute crisis that movies mistake for the entire apocalypse, the real war isn't against the infected anymore. It's against starvation, against waterborne illness, against infected wounds and medication dependency, and the slow cognitive erosion of chronic malnutrition and sleep disruption. The most valuable person in your group in that war is not the one carrying the most firepower. It's someone with deep functional knowledge of food production, not stored cans, actual soil knowledge, seed cycles, planting calendars, soil amendment, harvest timing, preservation. The person who knows how to make land produce food is, in any scenario extending past the first month, worth more than every weapon in your group combined. Behind that, water. Sourcing it, testing it, purifying it with improvised means when commercial filtration is unavailable. Behind that, trauma medicine, wound management, infection identification, improvised suturing, the difference between a wound that heals and a wound that kills you over 10 days. A group of 5 people anchored around a farmer, a water specialist, and someone with serious field medicine knowledge, even completely unarmed, even without a single tactical skill among them, will outlast 5 armed fighters in any scenario that extends past the kinetic opening phase. That opening phase is what movies think the apocalypse is. The first few weeks of acute crisis, the immediate danger, the dramatic confrontations. Survivors who make it through that phase don't emerge into a second act of continued high-intensity survival. They emerge into something much harder to cinematize. Months of agricultural labor, water management, medical improvisation, interpersonal friction management, and the specific psychological damage of living under chronic low-level threat with no resolution horizon. The apocalypse for most people who survive the opening phase doesn't end dramatically. It ends quietly, from something small, an infected cut, a contaminated water source, a medication they forgot to prioritize because it wasn't dramatic, insulin for the diabetic in the group whose needs nobody planned around because films don't cast that person. The rural safe house has real tactical advantages. Low population density genuinely reduces early exposure risk, and distance from urban centers creates buffer time that matters enormously in the first week. But rural isolation has its own catastrophic failure mode, and survivalist culture almost never discusses it honestly. Isolation from medical knowledge, isolation from mechanical repair capability, and most critically, isolation from the social density that produces resilient communities over time. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar's research on human group stability identifies a minimum viable community size for long-term resilience somewhere between 50 and 150 people. Below 50, skill coverage becomes inadequate, too many essential capabilities unrepresented. 5 people in a farmhouse, however equipped, isn't a sustainable community. It's a delay tactic with a pleasant view. The real long-term survivors in every historical collapse scenario and every studied disaster community share one consistent characteristic that has nothing to do with weapons or supplies or tactical skill. They had dense, pre-existing social trust networks, relationships built before the crisis, tested in low-stakes situations, shared history and mutual knowledge. The neighborhood where people already knew each other's names and ate at each other's tables and had an informal working understanding of who could do what. That social capital, built in ordinary time through ordinary human contact without any survival motivation, solves the trust problem before it becomes a crisis. And the trust problem is the one that kills groups from the inside out before any external threat gets the chance. Which brings us back to you, the person who's been running these scenarios. And here's where I want to be precise. That preparation instinct is not worthless. People who have mentally rehearsed crisis scenarios demonstrate measurably faster initial decision-making and lower acute panic response in the first hour of a real emergency. That's documented across multiple disaster psychology studies. You are statistically less likely to freeze in the opening moments. That matters enormously in the window when decisions are still reversible. But mental rehearsal trained against the wrong scenario produces something more dangerous than unpreparedness: confident wrong action. You've been rehearsing a movie. Your mental model of this event was constructed around cinematic obstacles that don't map onto biological reality, infection variability, or social collapse mechanics. And the hero framing at the center of that model is the single most dangerous cognitive bias you can carry into a real event, because it orients every decision around your own survival arc rather than the group's survival math. Heroes push forward when forward feels right. Survivors stop, recalculate, and sometimes retreat in directions that feel like failure, but preserve the only asset no supply run can ever replace. The real version of you in that scenario is scared. By day 3, you smell bad, and you know it, and nobody says anything because everyone smells bad, and saying it feels like the wrong use of emotional energy.
You're running on fragmented sleep and telling yourself you're fine because admitting you're not feels like the beginning of a collapse you can't afford. You're not sure if the detail your friend mentioned this morning, a headache, slight nausea, is significant, and you're terrified to examine that question too closely. You're counting other people's portions at meals and feeling a specific shame about it that you have no framework to process. None of this resembles the person you rehearsed. It feels like a smaller, more frightened, more morally compromised version of yourself. And that gap between who you thought you'd be and who you actually are under those conditions is where the real danger lives. Not in the weakness itself, in the inability to accept it. People who can't tolerate the distance between their self-image and their actual performance under stress make decisions designed to close that gap rather than serve the group. Decisions made for self-image in a survival context produce funerals. The ones who make it across every documented account are the most honest. Honest about gaps in their knowledge. Honest about their own compromised state. Honest enough to follow the quietest voice in the group when that voice happens to be right. Honest enough to be visibly uncertain in front of people whose opinion matters to them. So let me ask you something right now, while you're safe and comfortable and nothing is at stake. When was the last time you practiced being wrong in front of people you trust? Not hypothetically, actually wrong, actually uncertain, actually asking for help in front of someone whose respect you value. Because that specific habit, unglamorous, uncomfortable, requiring a level of ego management that no survival gear checklist ever mentions, is closer to genuine preparation than anything you could fit in a bag. The shame of not being the person you imagined you'd be turns out, counterintuitively, to be a survival asset. The people who make it aren't the hardest, they're the most honest. The movies don't end there. There's no score written for the moment someone quietly admits they don't know what they're doing. But the data ends there, every single time.